Hey all, we are in week 4 of our series, Won't You Be My Neighbor? And during this series, we've kind of been looking at what it means to be a neighbor, and the idea of being a neighbor, not just being something of the people that live next to us, but how we live in relationship with people around us. And it's an idea that Jesus taught through his story of the Good Samaritan. And during the first week, we looked at that story and realized that what Jesus was asking when he told us was to have a love for all people that we come in contact, even the really hard ones, or the ones that we just aren't supposed to love, being able to love them. During week 2, we looked at the fact that when we love God, we begin to love the things that he cares about and the things that he loves, including the people we just can't love. We begin to have love for them because of who God is. And he gives us that love in order to really show people how much he loves them and for us to be an example of that. And finally, last week, we looked at the call to love our neighbor and how it starts with loving ourselves. And Jesus tells those listening that the greatest command is love the Lord your God and to love our neighbors as ourselves. So the way we apply God's love for ourselves is the way in which we can then give the love to others. I remember when I was young, my sister and I would fight like cats and dogs all of the time. We would fight about everything at any given time. It was like a scene from the Civil War, family against family. And it was constant turmoil. And I'm sure many of you can relate to that. You and your siblings fight, your parents, your friends. And I remember when it all started. I used to follow my sister around everywhere, do anything that she asked me to do. I was her little real-life personal doll, in essence. I remember one day, for some reason, I had just had enough. And she had asked, we were sitting there on the floor in the living room, and we had a heating system that had these huge grates on the floor where the heat would come up. And we were sitting on that, watching a movie, eating popcorn, and she asked me to do something that I just didn't want to do. And so, true to form, she decided to double down and ask and demand that I do it. And that apparently was the end of her reign of terror. And what made things worse is that I politely, or not so politely, stood up, took the bowl of popcorn, and dumped it over her head, and sat back down and started watching the movie again. And to make things even worse is my mom laughed and made my sister clean it all up. And from then on, we fought consistently throughout the next several years of our lives. And the thing is that none of us are exempt from having conflict with people that we're around. Being around people often opens the door to conflict. Sometimes it might be as small as, you know what, I'm just tired and I'm cranky. And other times it could be this huge, blown out, massive scale World War III that's happening between you and your friends. But I guarantee that everyone in this room has had a fight or a disagreement with somebody in their life, and it often is not a pleasant experience, right? It's not something that we necessarily enjoy. Often in these situations, there are a lot of emotions and a lot of things happening that make these situations worse. Our feelings get hurt, our emotions get involved, we hurt other people's feelings, and everything just begins to snowball and get bigger and bigger, and everything starts spiraling out of control. And often we get to a point where we really aren't 100% sure where it all started. Or maybe you just have this thing inside of you when you see another person, you don't know why, you just feel upset or angry about that person. Anytime you see them, they just rub you the wrong way. And it's like this immediate emotional response every time you see them. And it could be something as simple as saying something that just strikes you the wrong way, and you feel your feelings getting hurt. You begin to sense that, and your feelings begin to take over. The person might not have meant anything by it whatsoever, but it simply struck you the wrong way, and you begin to tell the story in your head. And the problem is these stories are the place where danger begins to sneak in. Because we write this story in our minds of what we interpret the other person to have meant. You might know what I'm talking about, right? Your friend tells you that you look good in red, and immediately your mind starts writing this whole story about how your friend just told you that you're ugly and you look like a troll in any other color besides red. And how dare she say that? Doesn't she know? Fill in the blank. And you might laugh at the ridiculous nature of this story, but a lot of times huge blow-ups, major rifts, complete meltdowns start just like that. How many of you have had something like this happen? You said something and all of a sudden things are spiraling out of control and you don't know where it went wrong? Our human nature is to fill in the blanks of a story when we don't have all the information with a story that we write, whether right or wrong. And when emotion gets in the middle of it, it can get really bad. And that's not even to mention the times where like legitimate fights that could be, and legitimate offenses could be taken. Times that people do something that is completely wrong, completely not right, and it's completely hurtful to you or somebody else close to you. And these moments, it's really hard to remember to act like a neighbor and to respond correctly. But let me give you some good news. You're not alone. People have been struggling with reacting correctly to these situations for thousands upon thousands of years. So much so, in fact, that Jesus talked about this very thing when he was talking about to his disciples. In Matthew 5, Jesus is teaching one of his greatest sermons and right in the middle of it, he's redefining all the rules, basically. He says this. He says, if you're presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, and you suddenly remember that somebody has something against you, leave your sacrifice there at the altar, go and be reconciled to that person. Then come offer your sacrifice to God. Now, there are a couple things that deserve to be looked at in this passage, and things that we need to explore to truly understand what Jesus was really telling us. The first is that Jesus says that if you remember that if somebody has done something against you, or if they have something against you, it's your job to go to them. Do you notice that this is completely backwards from what our default is? Our default, our tendency, our human nature is it's their fault they hurt me, they owe me, it's my rights, right? But Jesus says something right here that turns this whole thing on its head. He says if somebody has a problem with you, you have the responsibility to make it right. Whether it's your fault or not, whether you started or not, he didn't give any of those caveats. God simply asks that you be the one to make it right. Here's the second thing that sticks out to me. And we could take the whole time on this one, but we just don't have it. But Jesus tells them to go and be reconciled with that person. Here's what Jesus didn't say to do. He didn't say, go tell all of your friends and make sure all the things that this other person did and make sure that they're on your side and they know that you're really right and that you were wronged. We all do this, right? We want people to agree with us. We want people to side with us, to tell us that we were wronged and that it isn't our fault. We want people to be on our side and say, no, you're right. You have the high ground here. But Jesus tells those that were listening, the first step in dealing with conflict is go to the person. Go to the source. It's your responsibility, and your responsibility is to go straight to that person. Because you see, when we bring somebody else into the situation, whether it be a friend or somebody else, we can create this triangle. We bring somebody else into the scenario, another person that is being hurt by the situation, another person to become offended. And oftentimes, offenses on behalf of somebody else are the worst and the hardest to get over. And by bringing somebody else in, we've created this triangle and we've added another voice feeding to the situation. And odds are the other person's doing the same thing, and all these voices begin getting in, and that's how it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally, Jesus says this, and this is probably one of the most important things to get right when there's a conflict. If there's something between you and somebody else, it says leave your sacrifice, leave your act of worship, and make sure that it's right. And the reason he says this is because if our relationships with others aren't right, it directly impacts our ability to receive from God. Paul, in fact, corrects the church in Corinth for this exact same thing, saying they're basically disgracing the communion because they're taking it when they have offenses with other people. God takes this stuff seriously. And the reason is that resolving conflict isn't easy is because if the enemy can get in there and he can create this tension, he's won. And the thing is, it's not easy, and it does take work, and it takes commitment. So the question remains, how do we do this? What are some ways that we can solve this? And so I want to give you a couple that just begin to start the discussion. Hopefully in your small group time, you'll be able to have some other discussions around this. But the first thing he says is collapse the triangle. Keep it between yourself and the other person. If you need to talk to somebody about it, find a leader or a parent or somebody that can remain impartial and not build into the situation, but help solve the situation. You find people that can help you collapse the triangle, not make it bigger. And that somebody that can help you go and discuss this issue person to person. Number 2, be quick to forgive. And forgiveness is something that is not easy to offer. But it is something that Jesus spends a lot of time talking about. It's the thing that Jesus is quick to offer to us, and he asks us to give it quickly. So while we could spend a lot of time talking about forgiveness, the key reality is that forgiveness is really releasing the person from owing you anything. It's telling them that it's not telling them that what they did is okay or that it's acceptable, but it is telling them, you don't owe me anything else. We're level, we're even, and you have no control over me any longer. You don't get to impact my emotions and my feelings. Next, redefine the relationship. Sometimes this can be go and say, hey, let's go back to where we started from. Sometimes it could be being friends for the first time. Other times it could be say, hey, we're okay, you and I. But in order for my protection and your protection, we just need to find ways to be able to deal with each other to where we're not constantly hurting each other. And we need to do this for our own well-being. And that's okay as long as it's done in the right heart attitude. So these are just some beginning steps, and this is not all of them. So discuss in your groups, what are some other ways? Because the discipline of overcoming conflict is not easy, especially when our feelings and our emotions get involved. And these steps are just starting places for resolving this conflict. And they're not meant to simplify this process in any way. They're not going to simplify it because it's never easy. But the truth is the saying that being a neighbor takes commitment. It takes dedication. It takes commitment to each other, it takes commitment to relationship, and ultimately it takes commitment to God. This week, think of some places where you may need to go and make things right with somebody. Who are the people that you may have hurt or who have hurt you? Find them and ask them for forgiveness, or do what's necessary to make the relationship right again. Because it starts with you, and it does take commitment. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll see you guys next week.